Okay, this is Endangered Species Act Part 2. We have 10 slides to go, so I should be able to get this done in 10 minutes, I'm hoping. So, Section 7, we were up through Section 4. We skipped 5 and 6. Section 7 is really what specifies federal participation. In 2008, Bush made an agency ruling that said agencies can self-permit if they can evaluate the Endangered Species Act themselves. But what does this Section 7 suggest? It says that it requires interagency cooperation, that other agencies must cooperate and abide by the ruling of the endangered species and other interior agencies to ensure an adequate protection of species. And this is a very, and the federal agencies then apply for permits, and the Fish and Wildlife Service issues or declines permits. Fish and Wildlife Service or NIMS rules on whether the action would place the species at significantly greater jeopardy. Now, this is an important little bit because agencies aren't just the land managing agencies like the Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife Service and BLM and National Park Service, but it's where there's any federal action. So this means that if you have some land and you want to go develop that land and you need a permit to fill that wetland, that requires a Corps of Engineers permit, and that requires Corps of Engineers rule or have a ruling on whether that filling of the wetland would constitute take on an endangered species or significant take on an endangered species. Similarly, if you wanted a federally backed loan, the loan office that you go through the federal government has to assure that it's not violating the principles of the Endangered Species Act. The Section 7 also authorizes the GOD Committee. This is a committee that can overrule the agencies and say that it's in supreme national interest to go ahead with a development even though it's going to cause significant harm to a species. That has almost never been invoked. Section 7, how has it been administered? There's continually complaints from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agency workers that they lack time to gain sufficient knowledge to make informed decisions. There's continual complaints that there's political pressure exerted from above, from congressmen in districts to not stop the juggernaut of development and rule in favor of the development rather than the species. The ESA is often criticized for stifling development. There have been very few attempts, or there's very little capacity because Section 7 rulings aren't part of the public record to evaluate this. But the World Wildlife Fund went in and looked at 100,000 consultations over an 8-year period, 7-year period, and found that the Section 7 only stopped 54 projects. Now, this suggests that it's not the ogre that the business world makes it out to be. However, it also argues that maybe the Fish and Wildlife Service isn't sufficiently forceful in constraining development, but it's very difficult to know whether this is an accurate view in that it doesn't say how many projects were changed or how many projects weren't applied for because of fears of the Endangered Species Act. So it's a pretty gnarly thing to try and get a good handle on. We're winding up on the law. Sections 9, 10, 11. 11 stipulates penalties. Section 10 provides a mechanism for the agencies to give private individuals permits, and this is then under the guise of habitat conservation plans. We'll talk about those. Section 9 basically extends the same constraints on the federal government agencies in causing harm to species to private individuals, and so a private individual requires permits in case of animals. Okay, so what then happens to endangered species? There's funds that go to protecting endangered species and trying to recover them. It's the federal agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service reports on their expenditures. It's a little bit over $1 billion a year, probably up close to $1.5 billion a year. Most of that money is not through the Fish and Wildlife Service, but through other entities. More than half, 60% of that money is spent on fish. An awful lot of that is because the money is generated by hydroelectric projects that then go back into mitigating damage to endangered fish. But irrespective of that, you look at the amphibians, insects, spiders, clams, and snails, plants. This constitutes 72.7% of the species, and they share just 6.5% of the recovery funds. That most people agree that there's very little capacity to actually recover endangered species down in this part of the spectrum, taxonomic spectrum, given the few resources that are applied to their recovery. And going back a few slides, if you remember what's being listed now, and if you look at, say, NatureServe assessments of what needs to be listed, it's almost all below that line, plants and invertebrates, and some of the lower vertebrates like amphibians. That there hasn't been a huge increase in fish, mammals, birds, or reptiles in listing over the last several years, but they get the lion's share of the money, and yet constitute a small portion of the total number of species listed. There have been a number of different assessments that say how has money gone relative to the Fish and Wildlife Service's own priority ranking system. So the priority ranks categories are over on the left hand on the vertical column, from high to low, and then the amount of money that a species gets is on the x-axis. I've forgotten, does it Tim Mayo or somebody, one of the papers that's come out evaluating the Endangered Species Act. And you see that those distributions aren't really different, that no one can find any particular relationship between the priority setting and the recovery spending in species, which is problematic. And but you do find something of a correlation that when we spend more money on species, they tend to be recovering better. This, of course, raises the issue of the counterfactual, what constitutes the good control for the observation. That a lot of the species that we're spending a lot of money on are things like the peregrine falcon and the bald eagle that would recover as a consequence of the restriction of DDT, and it's not clear how much that recovery funding itself actually drove the improvement of those species. And so if you then quadruple the amount of money and start spending the money on some of these less species that receive less money now, would we actually be able to recover them? It's not entirely clear. So I mentioned that there was then a big effort towards moving towards thinking about conservation of private lands, that in the Clinton administration they started doing things like this, partnerships for endangered species recovery, and we have a whole bunch of new rules that the agencies apply to work cooperatively with private state agencies and private parties to do endangered species recovery and protection of species before they get on the endangered species list. One of those, first and foremost, is habitat conservation plans. This is linked to, comes under the rubric of Section 10, where they're permitting private landowners to do developments, and habitat conservation plans can be done by an individual, by a local government like a county. So, for example, in California, where we have the Natural Conservation, Community Conservation Planning, the NCCP law, we have a lot of counties that are applying for both state NCCP permits and federal HCP permits that are linked to the county development plan, which is then a plan to say how much the county will set aside, how much the mitigation table will be for destroying habitat of some endangered species, and where that mitigation can take place. So if private developers provide a plan that accounts for the long-term protection of a listed species or non-listed species, then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service can issue a Section 10 permit for that plan. And it's good in theory, but it's often mixed. Yolo County is an example that years and years ago, like 10 years ago, there was a plan to make a habitat conservation plan. It allowed the destruction of, say, vernal pool habitats and then mitigating that with protection of trees for roosting for Swainson's hawks, and it didn't seem like a very good idea to most people. It went down in flames. And by the way, we're now going through this again with Yolo County, only this time it's a much better plan. Safe harbor is this idea that if a private landowner can improve their habitat, then they might end up with more individuals of an endangered species on their property than they had before, and as a way to not penalize them for habitat improvement. So if you have 6 of some endangered species, you improve the habitat, and now there's 20. It's just basically saying you can go into the Fish and Wildlife Service, get a safe harbor agreement that holds you to the first number, a lower number, and not the higher number, so that you can still do other things in your habitat and without calling for a permit. So anyone who provides increased protection won't be held accountable for the subsequent losses back to previous levels. No surprises is a rule that basically says that once the Fish and Wildlife Service strikes a deal, it's not going to change the rules. In other words, if it says that there's a mitigation of 3-to-1 for a particular species, they subsequently find that it's actually going to take more habitat than that. They don't go back and put the onus of that finding on the landowners, but absorb it into their own agency planning and try and protect the species through other means. So it's basically saying that they'll stand by their agreements. So additional protection is possible, but require full cost financing of that protection. So there's question and answer things for all of these things on the question and answer sheets for all of these provisions on the Fish and Wildlife Service websites. They've gotten very good about providing all the documentation from the Federal Register up through various different candidate conservation agreements online, so we can see what they're doing. So the last slide here is that the theme of the modern application of the Endangered Species Act is collaboration, 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 that they're shifting allocation of protection funds into things like state wildlife action plans and providing states incentive money to protect wildlife. The California CalFed Bay Delta program was an example of this, of trying to put money in before things were listed so that you have a capacity to protect things without listing things. As we all know, the CalFed Bay Delta hasn't exactly been a shining example of success, but that's what they're trying to do. So it's shifting allocation from triage of the hopeless cases to preemptive protection of systems before they become so at risk that they're not able to be protected. Okay, so see you in class on Monday. That is 24 or 5 minutes on the Endangered Species Act.